and identity within a global imperial context. Alongside the symposium, the YCBA has installed a display upstairs on the 4th floor and in our study room on the 2nd floor, which I really encourage you to look at while you're here. It brings together paintings and prints from our collection that sit on both sides of the conflict and opens up some of the complexity and the contradictions of this period. This program has very much been a collaborative effort. I'd like to thank colleagues across the YCBA whose work and support have made it possible, and especially my colleagues in the research department, Christina Ferrando, Jen Collins, and Susie Beckham. I'd also like to acknowledge our partners at the Lunder Institute for American Art, who have collaborated with us in shaping the program, particularly Erica Wall and her colleagues Gillian Scott, Caitlin Clark, and Mary McGrail. And finally, my sincere thanks to all of our speakers and participants for their generosity in sharing their time and expertise with us over these 2 days. I'm going to end with a few very quick housekeeping notes. This symposium is being live streamed and recorded, and the video will be made available on our website. If you're joining us remotely, please use the Q&A function to submit your questions. And if you're here with us in person, please wait for a microphone during the Q&A. We will guide you throughout tomorrow's event because I'm anticipating that you will all return with breaks, but the full schedule is also available on our website. And now it is my pleasure to hand over to Erica Wall, Director of the Lunder Institute for American Art at Colby College Museum of Art, to say a few words before we begin. Thanks.
Thank you, Gemma. I appreciate that. And I appreciate everyone for joining us here today. We are so excited, and grateful for you being here and being part of this collaboration. Today's program is the 3rd iteration of Lunder Institute at, which was established in 2024. The Lunder Institute at program was truly intended to create conversation between institutions so that they can actually work between each other, but also work to create transparency for and with the public. So with that, I am exceptionally grateful to the Yale Center for British Art for being in conversation and partnership with the Lunder Institute. I want to specifically thank Martina Droth, its director, as well as the amazing staff of program partners, with a special thanks to Gemma Field, Christina Ferrando, Laurel Peterson, and Rachel Chattelbash for collaborating, designing, and implementing what I think will be a spectacular program today. I also want to express my utmost sincere thanks to Peter and Paula Lunder and the Lunder Foundation for making the Lunder Institute possible. This has been an amazing platform that builds communities and benefits not only those at the Colby College Museum and its community in Waterville, but also what we're experiencing today and breaking the boundaries and barriers beyond our walls. So again, thank you, and join me as we partake in this amazing program today. And I will now hand things off to Mark Peterson, our moderator.
All right. Thank you very much. Thank you to the Lunder Institute and to the YCBA for setting this event in motion, and let's go. My name is Mark Peterson. I teach early American history here at Yale, and it's my pleasure as moderator to introduce to my right, as you may well guess, our 3 distinguished panelists for this first session of the symposium. So they are actually arrayed to my right as they are on the program. So let me begin first with Anna Arabindin-Kesson, who is Associate Professor of Art and Archaeology and African American Studies at Princeton University. And she is the author of, from 2021, Black Bodies, White Gold, Art, Cotton, and Commerce in the Atlantic World. To her right, yes, to her right is Professor Catherine Kelly from the College of William and Mary, who is also the executive director of the Omohundro Institute of Early American History and Culture, a critical organization to the field of early American studies. and has also been the editor of the Distinguished Publication Series at the Institute as well. She is the author of Republic of Taste, Art, Politics, and Everyday Life in Early America. Yes. And to her right is Ellen Hartigan O'Connor, who is professor of history and also, I assume for her sins, associate dean of graduate studies at the University of California, Davis, and an expert in the commercial history of the early republic and women's history from that period, and author of America Under the Hammer, Auctions and the Emergence of Market Values from 2024. So our plan is to have a conversation, and that conversation will involve thinking through tea, as we will be doing today and tomorrow. And so in order to think through tea, it seems to me that we, need to have some examples of it before us. So I'm going to begin by putting on the screen a couple of paintings and talking about them very briefly. And then after that, since I am something of a social historian, a couple of tables to put some facts in front of you about the world of goods of the 18th century. And then with that, with some stuff in front of us, I'll come and sit down in the vacant chair there, and we'll have a conversation about how we think through tea and aspects of ritual and tradition and fashion with respect to this in 18th century America and its wider world. So if you're ready, here we go. Upstairs on the 4th floor, you can find the original of this painting. This is the great 18th century British artist, William Hogarth, relatively early in his career, around 1730, painting the Montague family and an unknown attendant. Not only unknown, but unless you're looking sharp, almost unseen. The unknown attendant is seen in this, what we believe is a later cropped version of the painting, only by the hands extending a silver tray on the far left of the screen to the person there, the tray which appears to have an inverted teacup upon it, and may well be the hand of a servant and not unlikely an enslaved person in the household of the Montague family. The Montagues were among the grandest families of 18th century England. At the center is the Duke of Montague and his wife, the Duchess, who was Mary Churchill, the daughter of John Churchill, that is the Duke of Marlborough, famous for his victory over Louis XIV's forces at the Battle of Blenheim, in honor of which he built the splendiferous Blenheim Palace, which many of you may know. In other words, you're looking at a domestic portrait of one of the grandest families in 18th century Europe. The other painting I want you to look at is done within a decade or so of the one you just saw, and is from Rhode Island, of John Potter, there in the sort of center left, and family, by an unknown artist of around 1740 in oil on wood, which, despite the extraordinary differences between the two paintings, there are obvious similarities and familiarities. This too is a respectable family taking tea, and it too contains, although in this case not cut off in any way, an unknown or as yet unidentified servant, clearly of African descent, who also was most likely an enslaved person in the household. Now, this is a marvelous painting in all kinds of ways. Hogarth was a great artist. This is the grandest of British families of the 18th century. But it's not at all surprising that there's a painting like this, right? The grand British families in the 18th century, there are many and many a painting of this sort. What I would argue is somewhat more surprising is that within the same decade, in the town of South Kingston, Rhode Island, not even the metropolis, the center of colonial Rhode Island, but a reasonably prosperous farming town across Narragansett Bay from Newport, that there is a family essentially trying to imagine itself into the same frame that the Montagues are in Britain at the same time. That is relatively ordinary, not particularly well-known domestic scene in colonial British America is at the same time strangely aspiring to have themselves presented as well as they could in Rhode Island around 1740 as something like an equivalent of the Montagues as seen by Hogarth. So the couple of facts that I want to put on the table to help us think through the tea that they're drinking and everything that goes with it involves the relative wealth and its distribution and its production in colonial British America in the middle of the 18th century as these paintings were done. So pardon the relatively rough quality of these tables I put before you, but this one reminds us of around the eve of the American Revolution, how wealth was distributed in Britain's American colonies. This depicts wealth per free white person in British America. And if you look at the bottom, you'll see that the smallish number of free white persons in Jamaica, far and away Britain's wealthiest American colony, is immense at 1,200 pounds on average per free white person. For all of the continental colonies as a mass in 1774, the equivalent number is 74 pounds, right? 15-fold difference. And as you can see, looking below that, the farther north you went, the relatively poorer the average free white person in British America was. In New England, the net worth per free white person was only 33 pounds compared to the 1,200 for Jamaica. The second table, I made this myself this morning, and you can probably tell, gives us the value of the imports and exports going back and forth between the colonies and the home country, again, on the eve of the American Revolution. So the first of them, under the red, breaks down the colonies, again, by region, from northernmost to southernmost, by how much they imported in the way of manufactured goods from Britain. And so most of what those people in the John Potter family of Rhode Island are wearing, are holding, fall into this category of imports from Britain to the colonies. Now, not surprisingly, the West Indies have the largest amount, given how relatively wealthy they were. But if you add up all of the others from the lower South, the Carolinas, the Chesapeake, the middle colonies to New England, the rest of them imported more than the West Indies did. And even in New England, where, remember, the wealth per person was only 33 pounds, well, they are importing 420,000 pounds worth of goods from Britain in 1770. Below that, in green and in blue, are the value of goods that are exported from the colonies, and then the last one in blue in particular, that exports they sent directly to Great Britain and Ireland. And here, of course, you see the source of the great wealth of the West Indies. Close to 4 million pounds worth of goods are being shipped from the West Indies to Britain every year. And as you look below, most of what they export to the rest of the world goes directly to Britain. At the far end of the scale, New Englanders are exporting 430-some thousand pounds worth of goods, but only 78,000 of that value goes directly to Britain. In other words, most of what New Englanders, like that family in South Kingstown, Rhode Island, produce doesn't even go to Britain. Britain doesn't want it. It goes to the West Indies and other places. So those are the only tables you have to memorize for the quiz for this panel, right? I put those up there to argue or to propose that there's a real puzzle, there's a real problem here. Something strange is happening. That the poorest region of British America, and the region that produces the least in terms of valuable goods to send out into the Atlantic world and to send back to England, these regions are nonetheless leading the way in the acquisition of manufactured goods, including the teacups and the tea and the silver and the clothing and the mahogany tables and all of those kinds of things, right? That the relatively poor parts of the British Americas are increasingly becoming the biggest consumers of the stuff that the empire is being built around. So when we think through tea in this panel and over the next couple of days, I want us, in a sense, to keep in mind this problem, right, of how to understand the fact that the relatively modest people of the North American colonies are increasingly the great consumers of the goods that the empire is producing. So, with those facts on the table, with those images in front of us, I'm going to take the long stroll from the podium to the fourth of these chairs and invite my three co-panelists to open up, to discuss a bit about what they see going on in these paintings, in the world of the consumption of tea, and of course, the consumption of all of the goods that go with it. Because of course, no teacup is an island, right? They live in conjunction with the silver service and the china cups and the clothing and the decorations around them, and even the activities that the family is engaged in as tea is being served. And so with that, do I have any volunteers? I think I'm intrigued by Ellen's recent book on auctions, because that's one of the major ways that lots of consumer goods were purchased in North America. So I'm going to invite you to start us off.
Absolutely. Yeah, so I was struck in your remarks when you were talking about it being a household scene, because what I was thinking as I was looking at those pictures was the way that consumption is ritualized and consumption of tea is ritualized. So if we imagine ourselves there, that tea taking was an economic ritual. This is where I kind of want to come in here, that tea taking was an economic ritual, both in the sense that creating demand happened ritualistically in a group as they're taking tea and they're using cups in particular ways, right? That it's a choreographed event that you then invite people to. And I think that that's the other part that isn't captured in these paintings, where it's mainly a family group. But of course, taking tea is a social event. And that's the other way I think that it's an economic ritual, is that it involves making essentially business connections, social connections that are also business connections, right? If you think about diaries of the time, when they say, you know, so-and-so came and took tea, they're often describing a specific kind of social and business community that is bound together as merchants, as consumers. And so enacting this ritual within themselves is a social and economic ritual. So that's kind of the first thinking about ritual and consumption that I started with. And the second is exactly what you were talking about, that the taking of tea is an economic ritual that links to two other kinds of economic rituals. I would say shopping and auctioning, right? So other ways that consuming is ritualized. Like we often think of consuming as being instrumental, right? You buy what you need, or maybe it's play. Well, I'll just go see what they have. And but again, thinking about diaries or thinking about account books and kind of the repeated presence of shoppers in shops, sometimes in groups, that they're making selections that are also part of a social milieu, and it is that even browsing, kind of even considering fabrics, for instance, or considering teacups, is part of a pattern of socializing and communicating that then bonds together groups. And then I think I have another image that I wanted to kind of show. Okay, so yeah, this is kind of speaking to a couple of different ways of thinking about economic rituals and consumption. This is a broadside for a merchant in Philadelphia, 1772. And William Coates here has a nice woodcut image of a fantasy version of his warehouse. And you can see the objects that he's imported. And he describes then what he has available both for retail and wholesale. And as you're mentioning, you know, purchasing, I would say, it took some more controlled forms than we might think about, and auctioning is an example of that. That you had to know how to behave, had to know how to purchase things, and they had kind of a controlled and ritualized nature to them, to consuming. So in the case of auctioning in particular, it interacts in two ways with tea. One is, of course, the East India Company, in getting its monopoly, was obliged to bring all the tea to London, to store in warehouses, and then have quarterly auctions. And this was kind of, again, ritual. It's at a particular time in a particular way, and it legitimizes the monopoly. We're going to control it in one way. We're going to distribute in one way. It appears open. It appears to be fair. And the other way that auctions interact is another kind of ritualized consumption, and that is when there's too much tea in Philadelphia or in Newport. And then you send it to the vendu. In other words, kind of the used goods sale where you can get a bargain. And that's when all the little retailers can show up and kind of purchase oversupply of these consumer goods and then distribute them out to their networks as well. And so thinking about, kind of the multiple functions of these acts of consuming, whether it's drinking tea in a social setting, shopping in a social setting, bidding in a social setting, you can see how it reinforces consumer patterns and also how it gets economic and political purchase too. I mean, if we're talking about tea.
Well, I would briefly add, when I teach about this subject to my undergraduate courses, I have a parallel advertisement to this one here. It's from the same year, 1772. It's listing many of the same goods that were being sold here in Philadelphia. The only difference is that this shop was in Worcester, Massachusetts, which in 1772 was not the metropolis that it is today. That is, it was a very small, backwards, out-of-the-way place. But what the ad was promoting to the local farm families around Worcester was, you don't have to go to Boston anymore to get all of this stuff, right? So, I mean, Philadelphia then was the metropolis of America. It was the largest city in British North America. But part of what's happening is the process that Ellen's talking about is saturating more and more of the interior of this world.
Yeah.
Kathy, did you want to step in?
Sure. Can we go back to the Hogarth or the Potter, or both?
Yes, which would you prefer?
And thank you. My take and my point of entry to both of these pieces of art is really different from Ellen's. I'm a cultural historian, not an economic and business historian. And what both of these paintings, combined with a brief conversation that the four of us had a couple of weeks ago, and the title of this panel, made me think about ritual and this world of consumption in ways that I think I really hadn't before. For historians of early America, the rise of consumption in the 18th century is a fruitful and growing still field, and yet also a familiar story. We know that North America is more British by the mid-18th century than it had been at any time, right? That this is familiar. I began to think differently, perhaps, about that period when I thought about it in terms of ritual, and thinking about tea taking as a ritual. It's habitual. It's something that people do in a sort of a habit way, but it's also a ritual space, as Ellen suggested, where people come together, and you see that very nicely in both of these images. And in thinking about tea, particularly if we go back to the Hogarth painting, if we think about tea taking as a ritual space there, one of the things that happens in a ritual space is that we're disciplined and encouraged and engendered to see some things more clearly, to focus on some things, in part by unseeing other things. we focus in on these things and we read out those things. And I began to wonder what these two different family groups, the Montagues and the Potters, were focusing on as they took their tea ritually. What were they seeing, and what were they reading out of their fields of vision? I wondered what the Black attendants saw and what the Black attendants in both of those images read out in order to play their roles. I wondered then again about viewers of these paintings, which were hung presumably in rooms where tea was taken. What viewers...
If I could interrupt you for a second.
Yeah,
this
please.
painting was hung in that room. That is, it was an overmantel painting in the Potter family house. So it was, in a sense, themselves watching themselves take tea, right? So yeah,
subsequent generations,
yes, exactly.
presumably,
Yes,
watching them and thinking about that question about what people would see and what people would train themselves not to see in order to function ritually, both in the lived experience that the paintings are supposed to represent, but also in the lived experience of viewers of these paintings as they were hung in particular places. And it seems to me that thinking about these two paintings together really does invite us to raise new kinds of questions about the cultural, the political, and the affective work of tea consumption and art in the age of American independence. And I just want to put a little bit of pressure on something that you said at the beginning. Can I do that?
yes, of course.
I
Yes.
definitely can't do that with the mic. That's totally never going to happen again. You talked about the Potters painting themselves and visualizing themselves and imagining themselves into the world of the Montagues with their flat two-dimensional painting and their dresses that weren't quite as fancy and their, with all of that. I don't know that I think that's exactly what they're doing. I might ask whether, can we go to the Potter painting?
Mm-hmm.
Can we imagine that as something that is aspirational, maybe in the direction of a kind of a gentility that might reach toward the Montagues, but maybe it's aspirational towards other things as well. I would encourage us not to flatten out and just to assume that people are trying to consume up a social ladder, but to ask more open-ended questions about the affective and the cultural and the political work or aspirations that an image like that captures. And that's...
Well, I have a response to that, but first I'd like to ask Anna if she'd jump in here as well. And I know you've written about cotton, which I'm guessing is being worn by at least one of the people in this painting right now. But where do you stand on tea, and what would you like to bring into the discussion?
Thank you. Would we be able to go back to the
Yep.
Montague? I think that was a lovely entrance. I'm the art historian on the panel, so I'm supposed to talk about the paintings. But I think so. What I would say to start with, I think the affective is really important here, and seeing these works as themselves mediating ritual, so not simply a kind of illustration of what's happening in a kind of real world, but actually I think we might think about how these paintings are enacting a form of spectatorship, a new kind of spectatorship through consumption. We could think about the ways in which, yes, they reflect aspects of their sitters' status, but they're also in their reflective services, as you highlighted, they're inviting this spectators, they're inviting viewers to notice certain things, and through that noticing, become part of new modes of sociability, sort of rethink these relationships between self and a collective, between the public and the private. And I think, one way of sort of maybe seeing that, particularly in this Hogarth painting, is just noticing the way bodies have to respond, right, to the objects, to the tea, And Ramita, who's here, has written about this, but, just thinking too about how tea compels bodies to move in certain ways, compels you to hold your fingers in certain ways. And there's something about the way these, sorry, it's really, yeah, you can sort of see, but the way that the hands and the gestures, I mean, they create this sort of connective rhythm through the painting, but they're also, they kind of give the bodies a certain kind of ornamentalism. So it's almost as if it's not simply that, we could almost maybe say that the bodies are there to highlight the commodities in an interesting way. And so I think for me, there's also the way that painting here is part of this ritual process, right? The relationship between a subject and the painter, and the ways in which these paintings, circulate in domestic spaces might be an interesting parallel to think about the ways in which tea is also circulating. There's an image I have towards the end.
Oh,
I think it is.
okay. Let's see.
Yes. So
Yes.
this is a illustration from by John Ellis, who was a merchant and naturalist, and he's giving directions about how to build containers to transport tea. The idea was that they could bring tea from India to the US and establish tea plantations here. But sorry, were you gonna?
Pardon?
Oh, sorry, I thought you
No,
were.
no,
Sorry.
I'm just listening in an engaged way. Sorry.
No, please, this is a conversation. But I think it's interesting, to think about these plants and these samples moving through and into these domestic spaces. And again, thinking about what we don't see is within the frame is we don't see these movements. We don't see these kinds of networks, even though they're depicted, through not just tea, right? There's also silver, there's ceramics, there are textiles, certainly cotton, but there are also these human actors, right? The two, well, with the Potter painting, the young boy that we see, yes, and then in the Hogarth, the young person that we don't see, we just see his hands, which again, mirror the tables, right? So he's holding that tray in a very similar way to the way that the tables are holding up. So there is this sort of sense of him being a support system here, which is, of course, we know is the support system of the economies in both Britain and the US. And so I was thinking about what you were saying with auctions and markets. And I think one of the really interesting things that we can see with these paintings too is how these sort of market economics become part of a kind of way of seeing that is very, it's connected to establishing refinement, gentility, new modes of sociability, but it is also a kind of refining of vision that requires, seeing within certain frames and not seeing within others. And I would just, I guess for me, what I would invoke here is something that you came to at the end, right? Is Stuart Hall has this quote about the history being, British history being a kind of inside and outside history. So talking about these relationships between the colonies and the metropole. But I think what you're, and so he has this great quote about sugar and tea and sort of, being the sugar in the cup of tea, other people being the tea in the, and what both these paintings, I think, remind us of is exactly that inside and outside history. But here they're sort of materialized in a very private space. And so there's also this really interesting way that the private is becoming the political, and the paintings are mediating that in so many different ways.
So if you don't mind, can I ask you a couple of questions about the Hogarth in particular?
Oh, yeah.
The first is, so in the table with the tea in the middle, the tablecloth is folded back. And I'm guessing that's to show that it is indeed a mahogany or some other rather not just any old table there. Okay. So the Duke of Montague there seems to be lifting the teacup off the Duchess's saucer, right? He's holding the cup. What is that? Do you have a story of what that might mean? And because you were talking about the way the tea is, in a sense, staging the movements or the positions of the people.
Yeah, I mean, well, we have Tim here. Maybe he can join in the Q&A. I mean, I was thinking that, was about, again, showing these different kind of postures. And I mean, there's also these, what's really interesting to me is like the very attenuated fingers and the attenuated kind of movements. It's almost like this very strange dance. But I do wonder if that, there's a kind of repetition of support and layering and holding. Okay. And but I don't know if there's a very specific historical significance that you've come across with that relationship.
Well, I think they're using teacups that don't have handles, right?
They're
in the
kind of
18th
holding,
century.
yeah.
Yeah.
Right. What I like about what you're pointing out there is it connects to Kathy's comment about the way ritual spaces, and you're saying also paintings of ritual spaces, right? Obscure or subordinate some things while focusing on other things. And I think both of you have pulled out the way multiple forms of labor, both within the household and outside the household, don't appear in either of these two spaces, right? That it is a choreography, but we don't see the labor that supports, except for that one hand, right? Which just gestures toward the labor that supports it.
And that has a cup on it as well, an overturned.
Yeah. Do you think they would have recognized that the potters were in the same ritual as they were engaging in? I mean, to flip Mark's suggestion on its head, like, would the Montagues have seen what the potter's doing and see that as a shared ritual?
That's a great question. In terms of,
Well, so here's where I want to go back to Kathy's pressing question to me. And I think I maybe spoke too indistinctly in that I don't think the potters imagine that they are like becoming like the Duke of Montague and family. I mean, there's surely some aspirational sense to this, but rather more along what you were saying about ritual, that they're imagining in the same kind of frame. That is, they are performing in a way that is maybe recognizably like what the grand families of Europe perform. But what I wanted to add to it is that, so Ellen, when you began your discussion, you talked about it as an economic ritual. And there's a way in which the scholarship on the early modern Western Atlantic, whatever world, tends to do this separating out of the world of refinement and material culture from the other big, powerful, important cultural system, which is the world of religion, especially post-Reformation religion. And what I've been wanting to do in my work is actually to squeeze them much closer together, to suggest that they're, and in an article I wrote, I talked about this, that what this family or what that family is doing is not so utterly dissimilar from, let's say, the communion ritual in Protestant churches that are frequently being performed, in which all of those things you said about how you sit and what you do with the vessels that involve drinking and eating and that sort of thing are both performing a ritual, but also teaching people who are new to it or are just coming into it how to be part of this, and that what these systems share is a devotion to the wider project of human betterment of one kind or another. that through participation in rituals like this, as opposed to just, drinking whatever you drink every day out of a wooden tankard or something like that, you become a different kind of person. Right. And I don't necessarily think that necessarily means higher on the social scale or with greater political power, but that's kind of why I see these things as connected. That the extraordinary way in which ordinary farm families on the remote edges of Britain's colonial empire are nonetheless becoming these wildly voracious consumers of this stuff, right? That it's not all pointed toward the great and the good, but also toward the ordinary.
Can I just ask?
Yes, by all means, yes.
Just going to say, the only thing I would have added is that tea is also gendered. And I wondered if that, so, this is also a kind of, it's interesting that you have in the Montague male and female figures together doing something that is not necessarily, that's tea was, I think, more of a, would have been in a associated more with, I guess, with what women would have been drinking. And so but is that the same? Is that kind of gendered experience similar to?
Increasingly through the 18th century in the Protestant churches of British America, those are pretty gendered too, right? Yeah. I mean, this is a big subject as well. Kathy.
So one of the things that I want to pick up on that Ellen said, you were talking about the ways that labor was obscured in both of these images. And yeah, so much that, but also thinking about the Potter family. Those women labored with their bodies, with their hands in ways that none of the women in the Montague family labored. And their skin will be different. Their hands will be rough. They're not that. And so so part of the labor that's being obscured in this painting is not only the labor about the income generation that buys the tea, it's not only the labor of the Black servant, it's also the embodied labor that the women perform that's been erased in this painting as they vary,
That white linen.
Yes, yep, yeah, exactly. So there are different degrees of different kinds of obscuring or disappearing acts.
But interestingly, this enslaved boy is not obscured, right? Like, so it's interesting to me that actually his labor is not obscured. I mean, he's right there. I'm.
Although it is odd that compared to the Montague painting or the Elihu Yale one upstairs that we also looked at, this most likely enslaved boy is not performing any labor in the picture, right? The way that the serving is going on in the Yale portrait or in the Montague one, right? And what that means, I don't have a clue, but
I mean, I would read it as if he doesn't need to perform the labor.
Right.
It's sort of, he is an object.
Yes.
Right? He is, and so that sense of kind of recovering for us, trying to recover this sort of hidden history, it was sort of front and center in a way that makes it, I was thinking about those, you can think about those sort of plantation manuals or the accounting books, right? It's very clear from those sources to that the communities that have held them that this was kind of what sustained.
Yes, although considering South Kingstown, Rhode Island, it's not a plantation economy or anything like that. So in that sense, in the world, I mean, this is a sort of ugly subject, right? But in the world of this painting, the enslaved boy is as much an ornament as the tea equipage is here, right? Yes, they are part of the same labor system that the women are, and for that matter, John Potter is part of as well, right? I mean, what makes the Montagues is that none of them works, right? None of them performs labor in any way. That's how you knew what a gentleman or an aristocrat was, right? Whereas in this world, everybody works, right?
Picking up on your communion idea too, you know, we've talked about these as two family groups, and I just want to mention again how tea taking was social in incorporating others, right? So I mean, you wouldn't necessarily pay to have the neighbors in your portrait, but the neighbors were probably there a lot of the time, right? That it was not something you just perform within your own family. The point of the ritual is to incorporate others, is to be part of a community, is to strengthen and reassert economic and social and other kinds of ties. And that's something that doesn't show.
Yeah, and we know by things like probate records from places like Rhode Island going back into the previous century, it wasn't very much before this time when nobody did this in that part of the world, right? And so on some level, everyone in Rhode Island who becomes like this had to learn how to do this in the relatively recent past. And so exactly what you're saying, the social part of it is that by witnessing, seeing, observing, you learn, oh, that's what you wear when you drink tea, and that's what the equipment is, and here's how you behave, right? That's what I kind of mean by the improvement project. Yeah.
And it becomes a we, right?
Yes.
It's not just I'm going to go there and learn what they do, but we're now a we.
Right, right. Well, the little clock we have in front of us says it's 6:20, and we've been encouraged to take questions from the audience, which I can barely see because of the lights in here, but there is a microphone circulating, and I do have a vague impression of hands going up, so, sir.
Thank you. Thanks for the wonderful discussion. My question is about monopoly, and I suspect that this will probably be mostly directed towards Ellen and Mark. So, on the one hand, monopoly seems to be a constant tool of empire, you know, throughout the early modern period. That, you know, monopoly is built into the colonial trading companies' charters. You know, the whole point of those charters is that they have the exclusive right to trade. And then upstairs in the great exhibition about the East India Company, there are paintings from the Opium War of 1839. You know and so on the one hand, yes, monopoly a constant, but on the other hand, when I had my students read all 10 of the pieces of colonial legislation of the revolution in New England for our class this semester, what you find when you read all of those together and the Tea Act among them is that the Tea Act is by far the most obscure and difficult to understand. It's really like quite difficult to tell. And colonists had a really hard time figuring out. They didn't understand intuitively what was going on there. And it was only when, you know, Philadelphia really figured it out first. And so my question is the extent to which the tea monopoly is a novelty on an original move or marks some kind of break or departure in the empire and its economic management and people's relationship with auctions and monopolies and that kind of thing. Thank you.
Well, I think it's one model. I mean, part of the confusion and distress, right, is it was one source of many. I mean, you have the same merchants buying legal tea through the official means and getting smuggled tea, and then using their networks to circulate around the right kind of tea and kind of manage their inventory through all of these different ritualized methods of distribution. So, I mean, I think I see the East India Company monopoly as fitting into kind of a landscape of multiple different ways that distribution were happening, and, you know, merchants becoming pretty savvy at manipulating the different threads and avoiding the taxes that they could, right? That there wasn't just one way to acquire these goods, and that's what's very interesting about reading their correspondence, is how savvy they are of working these deals. And I guess that's the other reason I was trying to link those kind of economic calculations to taking tea, because I think you develop that expertise in these blended social and economic connections with others and with families, that then you kind of, that's how you engage with this bigger world of goods and gain that kind of expertise.
So if I could add one thing to that, the East India Company always had a monopoly on the export of tea from India to Britain, right? That goes all the way back. What happens with the 1773 Tea Act, because the East India Company is in crisis, is that Parliament grants them two things. One, they suspend the taxes that the company had to pay when they exported it to England, right? And so that was going to save the company a lot of money. And then they changed the distribution from Britain, right? So as Ellen was saying earlier, the practice had been that any merchant operating out of Britain could buy East India Company tea and take it and sell it anywhere. And what the Tea Act does is to say, well, from now on, only the chosen agents of the East India Company have the power to sell that in the American colonies, right? So it's a new monopoly that's added in terms of distribution.
Yeah, that they will then hold
Right.
the auctions or whatever.
Exactly. And so that narrowing combined with the reduction of the price that the ending of the drawbacks will cause also means that it's now likely that the price of East India Company tea is going to be the same as or maybe even lower than smuggled tea. So all of that bigger world of merchants that Ellen was just talking about are deeply threatened by the new monopoly that the distributors of the East India Company tea are granted. And that's what becomes, in some places, explosive. Yes. Yes.
Hi. I am so excited to be here and to be looking at these images with you. And one thing that jumped out for me was that there is a woman in the Montague picture who is making a piece of needlework. So she's literally working and she's creating what we would probably think of today as needlepoint or in the period canvas work, probably with wool on linen. And the way I was captivated by the way that the gentleman beside her is kind of touching the piece that she's working on and kind of expressively reacting to it. And I thought that that was very interesting in light of your wonderful discussion about gesture and how these gestures are kind of pointing us circularly around this image and around this room. So I wanted to point out that part of the image and also to think about making and how people also, in terms of the things that they're buying, commodities that they're buying, those commodities include things like indigo. So those are materials for making. So how this process of performing gentility can also make space for all kinds of production and creative work. So I don't know if you have a response to that, but I was just so excited to look at this with you and to think through some of these themes.
So I love the comment. I love the engagement. When I look at the Hogarth painting, one of the things that strikes me is for all of the opulence of the scene, there's not stuff on the walls. I mean, there's the bust over the fireplace. So a question that I would ask of this painting is, where is this needlework going? How is it going to be displayed? What's it going to do? Yeah. And how does that fit in with the sort of the aesthetic of the house? But I do love that there is an enormous piece of needlework in the not quite middle of that painting.
And also that it's being worked on a frame. So it's literally the point about framing what you see and don't see. Like there's this wonderful connection to that work that she's doing. And I agree. What I would really love to know is like, what is she working? Is it going to be the back of a chair? Is it going to be a card table cover? How is it going to further activate and reflect some of these same themes we see in the painting into the space?
Well, I read the YCBA online cataloging of this painting just this afternoon, and it referred to that as tapestry work that she's doing. But I don't know enough about this to even know what that means or what. But it does seem like the kitten at the bottom has tipped over the basket where some aspect of the fabric or cloth or whatever that's part of that is involved.
Yeah.
And the other thing your point raises is leisure. Like the way that leisure is also ritualized in this really interesting way now. And yeah, so yeah, I really appreciate that too.
There's a question down here and another one in the back middle.
First of all, I just wanted to thank the other speaker just now for clarifying what was going on there, because I spent the past half an hour trying to figure out. Jenny was thinking it might have been a puzzle, and I did as well. But I wanted to, now that we understand what's happening there, I also want to point out there's the difference in character between the work table she has where she's doing that tapestry work and the highly rococo table that the tea setting is on. And there's a real contrast there. And I mean, when you think about Hogarth and him being, sort of this sort of intersection between being an artist and an artisan, and I mean, obviously the contrast between those two tables, I don't think Hogarth was an accident. I mean, it seems to me there's something part of the narrative there, because it's really quite striking. I was kind of like, well, why the hell is this crude table in this fancy aristocrat's house? And it's such a strange contrast to the over-the-top rococo of the tea table. So I just thought that was another interesting piece about what's going on in this. So I don't think it's clearly not just about tea. It's obviously about, there's a lot of else. And then we've got the very bored adolescent boy with his hunting dog there. It just looks like, get me out of here.
If you look closely, you'll notice that dog is very pregnant.
Yes.
Yeah.
I thought that was.
Yeah.
I was just going to say, actually, I'm glad you pointed out the wood, because there's this really great article by Jennifer Chung who's written about veneer, and one of the things she points out too is that this kind of the relationship between the US and the UK around forests, and that there's a fear around a kind of, or not a fear, there's a forests are being, there's a shortage of of timber, and then so I'm not sure that might be one place to go in terms of how different kinds of wood, different kinds of timber, and come into these conversation pieces through again through this narrative around commodities and sociability. So yeah.
Well, again, I'm by no means expert on this, but that fancy looking large Chinese vase in the background, I'm guessing might be the most valuable item in that room. Yeah. And yet, the fact that it's sort of
in the fireplace.
Yeah, like just sort of, it's not front and center, right? Which may be a way of showing exactly who the Montagues are.
We can put our vase.
Exactly, yeah, and use it for an ashtray, perhaps. So we've gone a little bit past our time. Oh, there was another question right in the middle in the back. Yes, with the microphone. Thank you.
Really lovely way to start this. Yeah, and I really appreciated the responses from the audience as well. In response to also the monopoly question, I think we have to remember too that this extends to intra-European rivalry as well. We're talking about the Dutch and the English, the Dutch giving way to the British East India Company in China. And just so you know, India is not a tea producing scene at this moment at all. So when Ellis actually publishes that illustration, East Indies is a catch-all territory, so everything out there in the East. So it's China still. And then I'm thinking about the Dutch smuggling trade sort of network here that's also responsible in many ways for the hostility, but too, right? So anyway, thinking about opening up monopoly as a term that includes more than just the British in this instance. But looking at all these images, and I'm so happy, Anna, that you brought up the Alice image, because it reminded me, looking at the hands, that we are looking at a product that is so tactile on so many levels. You never see tea represented as pale golden food, right? You only see the vessels. So the vessels actually stand in for the plant, for the brew itself. And you mentioned sort of the conversation that the hands perform. It's also about materials and science and innovation at any given moment, because you're talking porcelain, we're talking silver. There's a certain memory of touch that is built through these materials, and then those materials are mimicked, as we know in Europe, to create other types of porcelain, right? So that gingerly gesture of holding up the cup in the water image was really fabulous, because it offsets, if you look at the diagonal, you have the boy on the other side and the teacup being held up. So I think that's a really interesting parallel going on there. And if you could go back to the others, I'm sorry about the box. One thing we forget is that these are, these are products of maritime trade. And tea is an incredibly fragile plant, among all other plants. And on the ship, you've got vermin, you've got dogs, you've got mice, you've got all kinds of things. You have salty air. So it was a miracle that some of these plants survived these long voyages. So when we're talking about the auction, when we're talking about market value, we're also talking about botanical. We're also talking about the ability, of this plant to survive, not just as botanical, but also as an edible. Right? These ships are carrying both the botanical as well as the edible commodities. So I just wanted to sort of throw these out there, that fragility and tactility go hand in hand, I think, with everything that we're talking about. Because the market value is also determined by literally how luxurious is this product. And the more fragile it is, the more luxurious it is.
Yeah. That advertisement also shows the packaging.
Yes.
William Coates is trying to show like the different, the boxes of tea, the barrels, the bottles.
Well, look, with a question like that, and with this group, we could go for another hour without any trouble at all. But we are now well over time. So I think I'm going to have to ask you all to join me in thanking our panelists and giving this symposium a great kickoff. Thank